I would like to start the seventh talk of the PMA talk series in 2025, and I would like to welcome all of you to this session. Thank you so much for being with us. Today, we are so pleased to have Dr. Fuchsia Hart with us. She is the Sarikhani Curator of the Iranian Collections at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and she's a specialist of Iranian art, got her PhD from the University of Oxford in the Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and she worked for her dissertation on the shrines in Iran and Iraq that were patronized by Fat Ali Shah Qajar, the second Qajar king. And currently she has done and is still working on very extensive research on English collections and the ceramics from Iran in these collections, if I'm right. And because we are all waiting for your article to come out and know more about this. And today she's going to talk about the Ades Collection of ceramics and the journey from Iran to England, which is promised to be a really exciting talk. So I'm giving you the floor, and please.
Thank you. Thank you, Shiva. I hope you can all still hear me. Thank you for the invitation and for that introduction. So yes, today I'm talking about something very different to the English ceramics at the Qajar court, which is what I've been sort of focusing on recently, and moving to think about a different collection of ceramics. So my starting point for this research and for this evening's lecture is Mehdi Bahrami's 1949 publication, Gurgan Faiences. So Mehdi Bahrami, I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. Many of you will be familiar, in fact, with the story of the Ades ceramics and Gurgan Faiences. But for those of you who aren't, I'm going to tell you the story. So he publishes the work in 1949, and Bahrami was the curator for Islamic art at the National Museum in Tehran, based in Tehran. And in the work, he publishes a group of late 12th and early 13th century ceramics, said to have been found and even produced in Gurgan in the northeast of Iran. Much of Bahrami's career did focus on ceramics. He also left us with very useful publications on luster tiles. And in all of his publications, he does very useful transcriptions and translations of inscriptions, which is incredibly valuable. But this certainly, Gurgan Faiences in 1949 was one of his most significant publications. But he did unfortunately die at a young age in 1957. But ever since the publication of the work, and pretty much immediately after the publication of the work, Bahrami's thesis about the origin of the ceramics published in the work has been debated. And at the time, reviewers pointed out numerous inaccuracies in the work, which really didn't help the way that his thesis in general about the origin of these wares in Gurgan, as opposed to being made, of course, in Kashan, which is the center with which we're most familiar as being a real center of elite ceramics production in that 12th, 13th century period. So his theory was really challenged. This is despite the fact that in the work, he publishes photographs. He argues that the objects that he's publishing had all been discovered by Turkmen locals, as we can see here on the screen, digging in the small tepes, the small mounds around Gurgan. And here we can see some photographs from the digs in Gurgan, which Bahrami then published in the work. Now, I don't think that Bahrami necessarily had direct access to the digs, but this shows us that he either had that or he had access to the people who had direct access to the digs. And here we can see that this photograph is from Audan Tepe, which is one of the most notable sites to which a lot of objects have been attributed. So what we can also see here is a local digger standing with a very large storage jar. And this is a key part of the narrative put forward by Bahrami, which continues today, is that this group of objects, which became known as the Gurgan Hoard, were actually in remarkable condition. Many of them were said to have been found intact, looking as if they had just come off the shelf, if they've just come off the wheel of the potter, in fact. They were in really remarkable condition. And this is said to have been thanks to the fact that they were found in storage jars. So these large storage jars were said to have been packed with ceramics, and they provided protection. And the myth, let's say, that accompanied these discoveries was that it was likely that a merchant in the region had packed all of these ceramics into large jars in order to protect them from the oncoming Mongol onslaught of the 1220s. So we're looking at a moment here just prior to 1220. But as well as publishing this evidence of a sort of a stash, a hoard of such ceramics, Bahrami also published evidence of kilns. Although, as I say, this was not widely accepted at the time. Although later archaeological digs in the region, most notably Kiani in the 1970s, again did find evidence of ceramic production in the region. So in Bahrami's work, he publishes 111 objects, and in this group sort of that became known as the Gurgan Hoard. And of those 111, 46 were owned by Clement and Raymond Ades. And here in some further plates from Gurgan Faiences, we can see an example of an object owned by Clement Ades on the left and another owned by Raymond Ades on the right. And Clement and Raymond were uncle and nephew. Clement was Raymond's uncle. Both of these objects are now in the V&A, which is, of course, the real connection with this. And we're going to see them again shortly. But I wanted to give you a bit of a further background to the Ades family, because it becomes important when we want to think about the Cairo context within which these objects were being bought and sold. So the Ades family were a Jewish Egyptian family. Eli and Clement were the sons of Nessim, who had founded a department store in Cairo in 1899. And their family had really made their fortune in the trade of cotton, and then largely in selling textiles. And Eli and Clement's generation were British and had close links with Europe. Clement went on to live in Switzerland, and he actually died in Paris. So it was initially Clement and his brother Eli who made the acquisition of a large number of ceramic objects said to have been from the same source, which they are largely recorded as having thought to have been found in Gurgan. So Eli acquires the ceramics. They both acquire the ceramics in 1945, but Eli actually dies shortly afterwards in 1946. And he leaves them to his son Raymond, who was based between Cairo and England. So this is why, in general, we're dealing with Raymond and Clement, but they're actually they're in two different generations. So Raymond inherits the collection from Eli in 1946, and he actually he gives details of a wonderful meeting in 1946 when Bahrami comes to visit him, along with Arthur Lane, the ceramics curator from the V&A, Ernst Kuhnel, the renowned German Islamic art historian, as well as Gaston Vier, who we're going to meet a number of times today, the curator of the Museum of Arab Art in Cairo. So they all see the acquisition when he acquires it after his father's death in 1946. And just to sort of finish up a little bit on Raymond's half of the collection, he then actually offers the V&A loan of the objects in 1948, but we'd already accepted a loan from Clement. So Raymond's collection goes on loan to the Fitz, but to come to the V&A collection, there are 41 objects once owned by Clement and Raymond Ades, now in the V&A collection, all again of that late 12th, early 13th century ceramic production, which in the past has been associated with Kashan, but Bahrami was obviously arguing was associated with Gurgan. But as you can see, we're looking at ceramic objects of very many different types in terms of shape and glaze technique, but obviously all of a fritware body. So this initial relationship between the V&A and the Ades family was through the loan from Clement. So very shortly after acquiring the objects, Clement lent 20 of his objects to the museum in 1948. Those 20 objects were then gifted to the museum by Clement in 1977. And then immediately after that, he gave 15 more objects in 1978. So that's a total of 35. So then the last 6 in the collection were allotted to the museum through the acceptance in lieu scheme by the 4 children of Raymond Ades, who had in turn inherited them from him. So the V&A's collection is largely from the collection of Clement Ades, with only a few from Raymond. And we're very lucky at the museum in that we have in general, we have a very rich archive relating to our past acquisitions. We have a very chunky, what we call a nominal file, an NF, on both Adeses, Clement and Raymond. And it's fantastic leafing through it to see some of the ways that curators of the past have looked at these objects. And this is just one example of a document which was used by the curator when that original loan from 1948 was then turned into a gift in 1977, and they added all these sweet little drawings of all the vessels next to it to help them identify them. So I will show you one more piece from the archive as well, because we're also lucky to have some photographs of the objects in a very different context. This would be in Clement's house, but there's really a wealth of material relating to the collection in the archive, which I've been lucky to draw on. I wanted to mention that in 1976, Raymond's collection was displayed at Blewitz in conjunction with the Festival of Islam. But this I really just wanted to use to emphasize that the Gurgan link really persisted. So in 1976, this is Raymond's collection, but it's still very much being presented as part of the Gurgan hoard, here being labeled as the Gurgan finds. And still today, the V&A catalogues the objects which came from the Ades collection as having been discovered in Gurgan. Now, I know many of you are familiar with the objects, but I just want to run through them so that we can just have an idea about the sort of objects that we're dealing with. So this, with its acquisition number of 1977, is part of the first gift from Clement, a very large piece, spectacular piece of Mina'i ware, which might not have the delicacy in the painting of some of the smaller pieces, but is still really spectacular. And then another favourite piece also on display in the Jamil Gallery of Islamic Middle East at the V&A is this plate with this beautiful monumental figure. This acquired through acceptance lieu in 2019 is from Ellie, so through Raymond, then on to one of his 4 children. Now, a point that I want to make here, which is as stunning as this is, when our conservators assessed it, they found that this has been broken into approximately 60 pieces. So while it may, of course, like many ceramics from the region that have, been through the market, while it may look like it's in very good condition, when you actually look at it more closely, it is very much not intact. So already just trying to dispel a little bit that idea that they are all intact, found as if they were new. The same goes for this piece, which I think seeing these 2 pieces together, you can see they're very much in the same style, particularly with that sort of pseudo-epigraphic border. Some more dishes, which again, I just want to show you the bottom of this piece to show that we have some historic collection stickers on the objects. Some just have sort of individual numbers. Some of them tell us which collection, which of the Adeses the collection came from. Then, of course, there are other types of vessels, such as bottles. And this is from Clement's second gift in 1978. And then some of the favourites, I think, some of my favourites, but everybody's favourites, are the figures. And this chap on the left, of course, he's in fantastic condition, but he also is actually in 5 pieces in reality. But our sort of slightly morose, grumpy-looking lion on the right is in very good condition and is a real star in the Jamil Gallery. But not all of the objects are luster. There are some beautifully painted underglaze painted wares, and this is one of the objects that is in absolutely incredibly good condition. It's intact. As you can see, it has very little wear or corrosion on it. It's just, I'm not sure whether you can see my mouse, but it's just on this lower rim here that there's a little bit of evidence of burial. But it's, and when I'm lucky enough to handle this, it's very finely potted. The walls are very thin, and it's remained intact and is in very good condition. And similar case with this piece, but as we can see here, there's more evidence of burial. And then there are some other sort of more iconic and unique, well, not quite unique, but some slightly different pieces. These really remarkable cock's head ewers with their incredible double-shelled bodies, which again survives in remarkably good condition. And then objects that we have on display, not in the Jamil Gallery for Islamic Art, but upstairs in the ceramic galleries, there's also a number of monochrome glazed wares as well. So that's really just to give you the overview. For those of you who are familiar with the collection, you get a little bit of a refresher. It's always a treat to see these again. That's sort of an overview of what we have in the V&A. But there are objects, of course, in other collections as well. So the whole of the Ades collection, so the two collections of Raymond and Clement together, numbered around 150 pieces. And so the collection is now split across a number of museums, and most notably the Fitzwilliam Museum at the University of Cambridge has the largest number of pieces. That's 70 pieces that largely came from the collection of Raymond. And this is just one of my favorites here. Again, one of those figures, a horse and rider, and I've given it to you from both sides that you can see this. I mean, it looks sweet in the ceramic, but it probably wasn't a sweet cat because it's probably a very deadly hunting cat. But in the background here, you can also see, for those of you that haven't been to the Fitz, the sheer number of pieces from the collection that are on display at the museum. And in connection with the Fitz, I wanted to mention the work done by my colleagues, the archaeologist Carmen Ting, who's now at Leicester but was previously at Cambridge, and the conservator Flavia Ravaioli, who have been working on a project on the Ades Collection objects in the Fitz. They did some scientific analysis and other analysis, as well as working with my V&A colleague Mariam Rossa Owen and the brilliant ceramic luster ceramicist in Iran, Abbas Akbari. And I can really recommend on YouTube, if you do want to know a bit more about their work, I can recommend watching this video of a small sort of workshop that they convened, and particularly Carmen and Flavia's work reveals a number of proposals about the group of objects, including those discussions of how intact they may or may not be, how the number of different workshops that might have made them an evidence for various burial contexts. And excitingly, Carmen and Flavia are continuing their work on their scientific work on the collection with a grant from the British Academy, and we hope that they'll also study the objects from the V&A, and that we will be able to work collaboratively on sort of linking up our research. Just to mention some of the other museums, so there are objects from the collection also in the British Museum, the Ashmolean, the Oriental Museum in Durham, and also in Bristol. And here again is just the selection of objects that are in Bristol. You can see echoing what we've got at the V&A. So we have to see the Ades collection as a whole, these two collections, seeing them as a whole, because they were supposedly acquired from one source. But I'd argue that to understand the Ades collection better, we also have to study it in light of the other pieces published by Bahrami in Gurgan Faiences as having come from the same find context. I mean, that's the argument. So we should interrogate this and consider all of these objects together. And in the work, Bahrami publishes objects from a number of collections, mainly private, but some from the National Museum in Tehran. But notably, all of the collections are based in either Tehran or Cairo. So it's very clear that a large number of this group of the hoard have traveled to Cairo. So later, I want to add that later, some of these objects, of course, then do travel elsewhere. For example, individuals such as Sigmund Tillinger, who was based in Iran at the time, who then later went to the US, and he took the objects with him, and many of those today remain in the US. So the objects have moved around, of course, but at the time in 1949, they were largely in Tehran and Cairo. So notably, 34 of the objects, so that's sort of the next largest chunk after the chunk represented by the Adeses, belongs to a certain Jacques Matossian. Some of those objects, there's two of them on the screen, are now very well known, such as the two here in the Freer in the National Gallery of Asian Art in DC. But others of the objects that he owned, according to Bahrami, are now in the David Collection in Madrid. They appear for sale on the international art market. So it's clear that Matossian is a big figure in the history of these objects because he owns so many of them. So who was Jacques Matossian? Well, I don't yet have a photograph, so if anybody can help me with that, that's one of the things I'm working on. So for the moment, this biography of him published in 1933 will have to do to fill my slide for the moment. So Jacques Johannes Matossian, he was born in Cairo in 1894. His father, like so many other Armenians, had left Ottoman Turkey for Egypt in the late 19th century. Now, the Matossians, like the Adeses, they were wealthy business people in Egypt in the late 19th and early 20th century. The Matossians made their money through tobacco, and you can find lots of wonderful Matossian cigarette tobacco ephemera online. So Jacques' father, Johannes, had established a tobacco business in the 1880s. Then when he died in 1927, Jacques and his brother Joseph took over the management of the company. But alongside this, Jacques Matossian was a keen collector of art. Now, this biography, published in 1933, really emphasizes, it begins saying he's a specialist in Egyptian and Coptic art, and he's very much known for that. He had addresses in Cairo and Alexandria. He was also a keen sportsman, and you'll see why this will become relevant again later. But he was very active in fencing, billiards, horse racing, and with the social set that entailed as well. And he died in 1963 in Paris. So he left. He gravitated. He traveled a lot. He traveled to Iran, to Europe frequently, particularly Paris, London, New York. But I think more from the 1950s onwards, he was based in Paris, and he died there in 1963. Now, I've been lucky to speak to one of his descendants. He had no children, but unfortunately, it seems at the moment that he left behind no diaries or papers. So we have to try to piece together his biography a little bit from the objects that he left behind, and perhaps other archival sources as well. And some of those sources that we do know of him through are the contacts that he had in Iran. Of course, Bahrami he knew, as I'll elaborate on. He also knew Herzfeld. And it is clear that he traveled to Iran on a number of occasions. So I want to come back to Bahrami now that you're familiar with the Ades Collection and the wider proposed Gurgan finds, because I want to outline some of my questions that I have about the objects and these sort of proposed collections. So I have to return to Bahrami because it was really Gurgan Faiences that first led me onto the trail of Matossian. And now I have to say that there was anecdotal evidence from the Ades family that the ceramics were purchased from Matossian, but I was really interested in looking into his role further. So Bahrami piqued my interest not only because he published so many pieces belonging to Matossian, but because I'd argue Bahrami hints that Matossian funded the publication of Gurgan Faiences, which was published in Cairo in 1949. So, in the preface to the work, Bahrami writes the realization of this, the work, however, was not possible until in the spring of 1947, Mr. Jacques Matossian generously offered his assistance for the preparation of a well illustrated work in English. Now, I'm potentially interpreting that as financial assistance, but it may also have been the assistance in connecting Bahrami with the Adeses, for example, and the other collectors whose collections in Cairo are featured in the work. So that's something, that's a matter of speculation, but it's clear that Matossian did have a role in the publication of the book. So, with, of course, those 34 objects owned by Matossian in the book, it could also be interpreted as a very good bit of marketing on his behalf, should he want to sell those pieces. And he did indeed go on to sell some of those objects. And as mentioned, they're now in various European and US collections. And that's part of what I'm trying to do at the moment, is really to track down as many of those objects as possible to look at the wider diaspora of the Gurgan finds. But of course, it's huge. However, alongside this statement, Bahrami is, I suppose, slightly unsurprisingly vague about how the objects were dispersed from Iran, stating that the first examples of the recently discovered pottery were offered on the Tehran market and found their way to Cairo. So, this passive phrasing of found their way to Cairo really begs the question of how did they find their way to Cairo? Who took them from Tehran to Cairo? And what was that journey like? And Bahrami's work was actually reprinted in 1988, and I saw a review by Mariana Shreve Simpson, and she commented in her review that the work may well end up having greater historiographical value than it does art historical value, which obviously is quite a sharp review, but I think that is how I have used it, because you can recreate this world of the collections and the networks, perhaps, of people who owned these objects. So, as wonderful as these snippets are into how these objects were potentially excavated, today I'm not really questioning the Gurgan connection. I'm not in a way able to go back that far in time yet. But that's a longer story. So today I really just want to examine the Cairo context for the works and look more at Matossian as a figure, as a person, as a collector, but also investigate his role in the movements and the buying and selling of these objects. Having said that, though, the Gurgan story should always be at the back of our minds, I think, because it's a narrative which so far has always underpinned the way that these objects have been presented, understood, displayed. This narrative is the thing that has been proposed as making them a group. It's the context, although it's ironically an archaeological context, which we will likely never fully understand, but it's that concept which makes these things into a perceived group. So instead of focusing on Gurgan, I want to focus on this little known figure actually of Matossian. He's been, mentioned in publications here and there, but there's never really been a clear picture produced of him. So really introducing him as a buyer and seller of the arts of Iran in Cairo and Alexandria, and starting to examine his role in the life and journey of the Ades Collection objects. I have many questions. How did these objects travel from Iran to Cairo? Who are the people involved in that? What were the mechanisms by which they were sold in Cairo to the Ades brothers and the other collectors? And how did they then leave Cairo for Europe and further afield? And I hope to show that Matossian was a key figure in the lives of these objects, as well as more broadly, actually, in the buying and selling of arts in Egypt in the 1940s, which again is a context which really hasn't been examined yet. And I think as our field is moving more towards interrogating the ways in which objects have been bought and sold and presented by collectors and or institutions in Europe and the US, let's say, I think the context of Egypt has not really been examined yet. And I think it's actually, I think it's a really fascinating context. So as we've seen, this biography doesn't actually mention Iran. So this is 1933, and he's very much seen as a collector of Egyptian art and Coptic art. And this is borne out by some of the objects that we see in museums around the world. He did have a large collection of Coptic textiles. He definitely had a strong interest in textiles, but he also owned and bought and sold ancient Egyptian statuary and sculpture as well. But I'm not going to linger on that because we want the Iran context. So, in terms of the arts of Iran, I think the context within which many of you and other people might have heard his name, Matossian's name, what is in secondary sources relating to the so-called the Buyid silks. So early Islamic textiles from Iran. Now, this publication, again, we're going to come across Gaston Vier a number of times, and I'm hoping that one of you in the audience will be able to guide me on how to pronounce his name properly because he's French with a decidedly Germanic name, and having spoken to a number of people, we weren't quite sure. But he is important as the curator of the what was then known as the Museum of Arab Art in Cairo, now the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo. And this book is published in 1949, a collection of Persian silks, which are in an anonymous private collection in Cairo. It later became clear that the owner of this collection was Matossian, and so I guess the interesting bit of data here from me is, we can be certain that by 1949 he has an established collection of art objects from Iran. He is connected with the very, the most established authorities on the arts of Iran, even if Vier was the curator of the Arab Art Museum. He's very much incorporated into the world of arts and museums in Cairo at this time. Of course, as some of you will know, these silks then became the subject of quite a lot of question. They were brought into question, and the collection went to Cleveland Museum of Art, and was then later some of them were tested scientifically and were thought to be actually later 20th century productions. Of course, Blair and Bloom have written about this. So I'm not going to go into that in any detail, but it's just one example of the type of things that he was collecting that I think it's actually important for us to have this wider view of what he was collecting. But as well as the silks that were published in that book, we can actually look at his textile collection to push his collecting of the arts of Iran earlier. This is another silk that was published again by Vier, actually, in an article on textiles in 1937. And this was described as belonging to Matossian at that time. So that gives us a nice date range here of, so far we sort of have 1937 onwards. This object then went to Paul Malon, who you may also have heard of. He was a very well-known dealer in antiquities, Byzantine and Islamic, based in Paris. So there we have a connection between Matossian and some of the most prestigious, let's say, dealers in Paris at the time. And then these textiles all went to Cleveland, where Malon had a connection. And the same goes for this object, which is a very well-known object. It's Buyid gold jug inscribed with the name of Samsam ad-Dawla, which is again thought to have been owned by Matossian, then went on to Paul Malon, and eventually into Cleveland. Again, this is an object which has been questioned many times, but is quite remarkable. Either way, and I'm not necessarily going to pass judgment on all of the controversies around Buyid arts right now. He is also very well known for having given a significant gift of ceramics to the Louvre in 1949. Most notably, in a way, amongst these were some of what I think were some of the first examples of Nishapur wares to go into a European museum. Of course, the Met had been digging there from 1940, had the break for the war, but then went out for a 1947-1948 season. So these may well have been very recently excavated, actually, and shows potentially the way in which Matossian was working, that he was able to acquire things from Iran, and he may not have kept hold of them for very long before he moved them on, whether as gifts to museums or selling them on. But this also situates him in Paris at this time. And at the same time, in 1949, he also gave examples of luster vessels, such as we see published in Bahrami's Gurgan Faiences. The object on the left actually is quite interesting, as the Louvre cataloguing has it owned by Matossian and also owned by Gulbenkian, which is a link that I haven't examined further, but I would like to look into more. And just to round this off, he was not only collecting and giving objects from Iran, but also Islamic era objects from Egypt. So in the Egyptian context, it wasn't only ancient Egypt that interested him, but Islamic Egypt as well. And with that sort of specifically Egyptian context in mind, I wanted to turn to think about the Cairo context for the buying and selling and displaying of the arts of Iran. Now, I just wanted to start by saying, of course, it has very much been established that from the 19th century, the art objects from Egypt, from Syria, from Iran, from all over the wider region are being bought and sold in Cairo. Of course, Mercedes Volle is just one of the people that has worked on this. And the likes of the French artist Goupil and Gaston de Saint-Maurice are well known for having their collections with objects from Iran in their collections in the 19th century. And indeed, the V&A has objects from Iran which were collected in Egypt, such as this Safavid, it's a brass hawking drum, which Moya Carey has written about and published in her work, examining how the V&A collected the arts of Iran in the 19th century. But this came from the collection of the figure known as Dr. Maimar Hussein Fahmi, who was very much in the practice of collecting spolia, architectural spolia, as well as portable objects, and the V&A acquired it from his collection. Bringing it into the 19th century, of course, the most notable, I think, example of the collecting and display of the arts of Iran in Cairo is the Geir Anderson Museum in Beit el-Kritliya, Geir Anderson's home right next to the Ibn Tulun Mosque. Geir Anderson, of course, was I was about to say he was English, but I think he was actually Irish. But he also lived in England. But it was actually my visit to the Geir Anderson Museum, and then to Geir Anderson's English home in Lavenham, Suffolk, which really piqued my interest about the market for objects from Iran in Egypt in the 20th century. So Geir Anderson is collecting a little bit earlier than Matossian. He dies in the 1940s. So it's really, I think, around 1930, 1920, 1930 that he is collecting a really eclectic mix of objects from Iran, whether, here we've got Safavids, we've got, similar dates, luster tile, but he has Qajar works as well. So it's a real mixture. But it's really in the 1920s onwards that I would say the appreciation of the arts of Iran becomes somewhat institutionalized in Egypt. So a society for the promotion of the arts, Les Amis de l'Art, is established in 1924, largely based in Alexandria. And they held an exhibition of Islamic art in 1925 in Alexandria, with most of the objects coming from private collections based in that city. And amongst them were objects from the arts of Iran, although not predominantly. So it's sort of an interesting moment, 1925. I think we can see the interest in the arts and the arts of Iran growing. But then there's, I'd say, a sort of watershed moment is 1935. This is very much following 1931 in London with the exhibition of Persian arts in London in 1931, of course, is a runaway success and really inspires Persophilia across the country. And notably, there were objects from Egyptian collections lent to the exhibition in 1931. But in 1935, again, it's Gaston Vier at the Museum of Arab Art. He was involved in the exhibition in 1931, but in 1935, he decides to do their own similar exhibition in Cairo. And he's very much aiming to be on a par with the London exhibition in terms of quality. And the largest bulk of the objects in the 1935 exhibition in Cairo are ceramics, 244 pieces of ceramics, but also 222 paintings, book illustrations, 155 carpets and textiles, 137 objects in metal, and 16 objects in wood. Notably, while this is definitely evidence for an increase in the interest of the arts of Iran in Cairo, Matossian does not lend to this exhibition. So we're in 1935 here. The people that do are some sort of likely suspects: Geir Anderson, of course, Chester Beatty, who had a house in Egypt and was spending his winters there. Other dealers such as Ispenian and collectors, Harari, who did also was very well known as a collector of the arts of Iran, and interestingly introduced Clement to the V&A initially. So far, the earliest evidence I have for Matossian collecting the arts of Iran is that Seljuk textile that I showed earlier, which he certainly had by 1937 when VA published it. So I'm wondering even if it was this exhibition that may have encouraged him to branch out into the collecting of the arts of Iran, away from purely collecting Egyptian art, as we saw in the 1933 biography. Now, just for a moment, I have to step away from the world of art to talk about horses. And there is a good reason for this, because those people who were involved in the many horse racing clubs around the country, well, largely in Alexandria and Cairo, it really gives you an insight into the very cosmopolitan world of course, wealthy families in Egypt at the time. And I've spent a lot of time going through sort of society magazines of the day, such as the Sphinx. But this is a really helpful list that was published in a work about the Smuha area of Alexandria, which was being developed in the 1930s. And this is a list of the members of the Racehorse Owners Association based in Alexandria. And there will be a number of familiar names here to those of you who are in the field. Obviously, we've got both Clement and Ellie. We also have other collectors such as Parisi Bellini, Madame Chester Beatty, Chester Beatty's wife. We have Matossian here. We have the Rolos. They are also known as connoisseurs and collectors of art. So I would argue that there's definitely an overlap here between those who are, horse owners, because Madame Chester Beatty was a racehorse owner. And actually, I found more references to Jacques Matossian for his horses winning races than I have for his art collecting. But I think it's clear that these things went hand in hand, and this list helpfully tells us that Matossian knew the Ades brothers at least since 1934. So they had a pre-existing relationship in the 1930s, and they're very much in the same social world. And of course, this is a social world which is very cosmopolitan, includes Greeks, Armenians, Jewish families like the Ades family, Europeans such as Mrs. Chester Beatty, These are people who live between Egypt and Europe, and the same went for their collections. Their collections moved between Egypt and Europe, and even in one of the exhibition catalogs I just showed you, there's an advert for the Storer frères, the Storer brothers, who were dealers in Paris. So the Parisian dealers are advertising to the Alexandria set. So that's just to say that objects are not, objects that are actually coming from potentially from Europe back to Egypt. But this is really just to emphasize the social world, which I think, and the networks, which would have been business networks as well, which are really important for understanding the social world of Alexandria and Cairo at this moment. But also in the V&A archive, from correspondence with Ades's, we have good evidence that both Clement and then Raymond, Ellie's son, refer to Matossian as a good friend. So that relationship continued into the next generation with Raymond as well. So with all of this context, with what we sort of already know about Matossian as a collector, as a connoisseur, and we know about this context of interest in the arts of Iran in Cairo, we come to Matossian's 1945 auction of part of his collection. So it's very clear that by at least by 1937, Matossian is buying and selling objects from Iran. But what I find interesting about the catalogue is that now we know that it comes to 1945, and he's selling. But he's selling in a specific way. I've never found evidence of him having a shop. Like other, of course, Armenian dealers based in Paris or New York. He's certainly shaping himself as a collector, and he was, and a connoisseur, but he's also somebody who is clearly very much buying and selling quickly. And he has been described as a dealer. One description of him was that he was very much a collector earlier on and then moved to be a dealer later in life. So in this sale, in this auction in Cairo in 1945, it's likely that this was the sale that included ceramics thought to have been excavated at Gurgan. But we have to hold on a minute because to complicate matters, this object is labelled as having come from Ragas, which is the former name for Ray, the archaeological site to the south of Tehran, which of course prior to this period was known as a source for luster ceramics. So this object, which we might expect to have been excavated in Gurgan, is said to have been found in Ray. And this does get more complicated because the one thing that we do know about this object is that it was bought by Eli Ades, presumably in that sale. So we already know that Eli knew Matossian from 1934. We know that he acquired the collection of ceramics in 1945. So it's very likely that he acquired this piece along with all of the others, or at least many of them, at this sale in 1945. But this isn't published by Bahrami, I would say. So it wasn't, linked to Gurgan by Bahrami, but not only a fraction of the Ades collection was published by Bahrami. So that's not necessarily indicative. So what does this mean that this piece is described as coming from Ray in Matossian's 1945 sale? Well, I haven't quite reached a conclusion on that yet. I should say, I mean, it's probably clear, but this is very much something that's a work in progress, and I might even be at that stage where I have more questions than answers. But this prompted a number of thoughts for me. I had wondered whether Matossian was responsible, was very close to the digging in Iran. We do have a letter from Eli Ades where he mentions a friend digging in Iran. Of course, that could mean that Matossian is perhaps funding a dig, but really this is all my speculation. But this made me think, what does Matossian know about these objects? Um, does he know where they have been excavated? Has this been excavated in Ray? And then later, because it goes into the Ades collection, it becomes known as being part of the Gurgan hoard, and it's now, attributed to Gurgan. I should say I didn't actually emphasize that it's now in the Fits. And it's definitely, it's very much seen as being part of that group. Um, or I wonder, was Gorgan just not yet on the map? Ray at this stage was the place where many of these objects were thought to come from. This is 1945. Bahrami doesn't publish his book until 1947. Bahrami's also published an article before he publishes the book on the finds from Gorgan, but that's also in 1947. So I wonder whether Gorgan does not yet sell. So even if it is from Gorgon and they know it is, they might not want to say it is. So, this is really something that I'm questioning and still thinking about, and will probably be thinking about for a long time, along with the rest of the catalogue as well. The only extra thing that I would add here is that the date of the sale was actually very early in January in 1945. And the Bahrami and thereafter, it's always been indicated that the objects were excavated in Gorgan in 1945. So actually, if this is from Gorgan, it could actually push that excavation back into 1944. But they are all at the moment unanswered questions. I did want to just give you a little glimpse into some of the other objects in the catalogue, because again, it only builds on what we've seen from Matossian in collections around the world. It provides wider evidence for the other objects that were in his collection and he was then selling. So we have silks from Iran, Greek embroideries, Egyptian sculpture, and of course ceramics from Kütahya. So very much a selection of objects which were being bought and sold at the time and were obviously in demand in Cairo as well. Of course, we have to approach some of these descriptions with caution. Again, we have another piece here described as being from Ray. That has to, I think, have a question mark next to it. But again, it gives us an idea of his remit as a buyer and seller. And, I think I would say at this stage that that he even though this is an auction, that's not to say he's not functioning as a dealer, because while this transaction is in the guise of a collector's sale, we can also think of it as being, a temporary shop window for Matossian. And very much at the time, other Armenian dealers in Europe were also, it's been shown that they were argued that they were presenting themselves as connoisseurs and collectors, producing catalogues, excuse me, was very much the done thing. So we can learn something a little bit here about the way in which Matossian was selling as well. I'm coming to the end now, but just moving forwards from 1945 to 1948 and returning to the V&A, thanks to this document in the archives, again in the Ades file, we know that after the sale of the objects, and I've given you an example of one object, but I do feel reasonably confident that the Adeses did acquire, both brothers did acquire the collection, the ceramics from Matossian. We can see that after the sale, he's still involved in the life of the objects because he liaises with the V&A to arrange the shipping of the loan from Clement Ades to the V&A in 1948. From the rest of the Ades file, it's clear that Matossian visits the museum a number of times, although interestingly, no acquisitions were made from him directly, and actually it doesn't even seem like he offered the museum any objects. But this document does show us that, well, it certainly shows us that he has a lot of experience in exporting from Egypt, and it will just be in the following year, 1949, that he gifts the group of ceramics and other objects to the Louvre as well. So it's clear that he's moving objects around. He's familiar with Beirut, which I think shows another side to the way that he's working at this time. So to conclude, I hope that I was able to shed some light on the so far very little known Jacques Matossian as a figure in the buying and selling of objects from Iran in the Cairo and Alexandria of the 30s and 40s. But of course, this story also goes further than Cairo and Alexandria, because while I'm really interested in those sites in and of themselves as locations where the arts of Iran are being bought and sold and displayed, and they clearly have their own social capital in that context, I think that we can also think about Matossian's wider role through the diaspora of these objects, because of course, very soon after the Ades family acquired the objects, they were very quickly moved into collections like the V&A and the Fitzwilliam. And recently, there has started to be a re-evaluation of the role of other Armenian dealers of the arts of Iran, of course, such as Kelekian and Minassian and Kevorkian. And I think we can also start to think a bit about Matossian's role in shaping these important collections of the arts of Iran globally. But today I really wanted to use him as a starting point as well to think more about Cairo and perhaps specifically Alexandria, as we saw with the Racing Club, as a context within which Persian art, as it was then thought of, was being consumed. But it does then, with the very cosmopolitan group of people that were collecting these objects, it does also position Egypt as a staging post on the journey of these objects from Iran to Europe and indeed America, because as I say, the Ades collection, for example, and some of Matossian's evidently own collection moved on to Europe very quickly after they came to Egypt. Of course, as I've said, a lot of questions remain. At the moment, I'm dealing with a lot of sort of hints and indications and not a lot of smoking gun evidence. But I think it highly likely that Matossian was the link directly with Iran and that he bought these wonderful ceramic pieces directly from Iran to sell in Cairo to the Adeses, but also some of the other collectors whose works are, whose collections are featured in Bahrami's publication. We know that Matossian was traveling to Iran. He, of course, is a contemporary of the likes of Pope and Rabbanu. They also have links to the Buyid silks, so that's one avenue I'm really investigating now. But I'm still asking myself the questions about how and when this group of the Ades collection and the wider Gurgan finds, how and when this group was formed and by whom. Was it Matossian who helped to shape this group in Iran, or did he just buy them as a group from one other dealer? So these are the questions that I'm going to continue to look into. But I hope that I've managed to give you a bit of a view of the life of these objects while they were in Cairo. And I hope that I'll be able to slowly work back from Cairo through Iran and perhaps arrive in Gurgan at some stage with this story as well. So thank you. There's definitely, I think there's time for questions, and I'd love any comments as it's very much a work in progress, but this is my email address as well if anyone wants to be in touch about it afterwards.
Thank you very much, Fuchsia. That was super rich, very thought-provoking, and really amazing presentation. And I personally have never encountered Jacques Matossian before, and it was very eye-opening for me. And it shows that such figures were of utmost importance in the way that these collections were formed, and we do not know much about the provenances. Excellent job. Thank you so much. Um, there's time for Q&A, and I think you can just drop your question in the chat or simply unmute yourself and ask directly if you like.
I've got the chat open. I can see that Sina asked, were they Seljuk ceramics? So yes, everything is thought to be pre-Mongol within the Ades collections. Within the Ades collection, and within the wider Gurgan finds. However, I didn't really go into this, but I'd say looking across the board at Gurgan, the objects attributed to the Ades collection and other collections published by Bahrami, and also other objects which are maybe said to have been found at Gurgan, that are perhaps circulating on the market now, or they're in other collections that weren't published by Bahrami. There's evidence that there are things of different dates. There may be pieces that were much earlier found at Gurgan. Then there are probably pieces which are much later, which have been subsumed into the group. So that's, one of these questions about yes, is this a real group, and at what stage did this become a group? But yes, the bulk of things that I showed from the V&A are late 12th and early 13th century. So yeah, all pre-Mongol. I can see Richard's got his hand up.
Hi, that was great. Thanks so much, Fuchsia. Really fascinating and rich talk. I really enjoyed it. I was just going to ask about, given how many of the seemingly perfect pieces aren't, but there are quite a lot of very much largely perfect. Do you think that's a good basis to disaggregate as a starting point? Because the repaired pieces, they could be from Gurgan, but they could be from anywhere. And the second point is just to ask about whether you think the references to Ray are likely to be more based on Pope's then still fairly recent survey of Persian art attribution, rather than any specific, oh, I know it was found there. I know that is conjecture either way, but just just wondered what you thought about that way to divide the two.
Yeah, I'll start with the last point. I mean, I agree. That, before Gurgan kind of came onto the scene, these objects, yes, that attribution would definitely be Ray. So I think it's more, yeah, the thing that interests me is, what did Matossian think? Um, did he think they were from Ray? Or, did he know that they were from Gurgan, but he was selling them as being from Ray because that was the attribution, the current attribution. So, but yes, I think that's pretty, yeah, I think that's safe conjecture. Yeah, on the objects being intact, it's really difficult. I've been thinking about this, and both at the V&A, our conservators have looked at the repairs, and Flavia at the Fitz has also looked at the repairs, and we have evidence such as Francesca Leone's work on the luster dish at the Ashmolean, and we have all this information about objects being repaired and put together from sherds and whatnot in Iran. That I think it's going to be you could probably work out where the repairs were done, and I think that has been done in some cases, but it's really hard to say, that dish that's like shattered into 60 pieces, it could have been found intact, right? But then someone dropped it on the way to Tehran or Cairo. I think it's so hard to know at what stage these things, unless, yeah, you might be able to tell for some of them, but I think I'd find that it's hard to give that kind of, for that to be hard and fast, basically. But yeah, I think it's worth looking at them in those groups as well.
Thank you.
Rosalind has a question. She's telling you that this was a great lecture. We agree. And have you found any links with Mahbubians? They were paying to excavate in Iran in 1930s.
So I actually haven't yet. I wouldn't be surprised, but I haven't found a direct link yet. But thank you. I should definitely. I mean, of course, we all know these networks were so interconnected, and I really wouldn't be surprised if they did know each other. But I think at the moment I'm kind of going down the Rabanu link, which I'm hoping might be productive, but we'll see. I'm just reading Jamie's question. She's asking if there's any angle with the 1931 exhibition. 1935 connection stronger. I haven't really thought about that. I mean, I guess I'd only thought about the effect of 1931 in that it spurred the Cairo 1935 exhibition. But it's a good question. I don't know whether Matossian would have. He may have seen the exhibition 1931 as well. That's something that I don't know. It's as I say, not having access to any of his papers makes this makes it difficult. I can only piece together sometimes where he is from other people's mentions of where he is. So I know he visited London many times, but I don't know if it was in 1931. But thank you, it's good. Yes.
I think
Good to
Sina is
consider. Thank you.
also, sorry, Sina is also asking, are these books available to find? And he would like to see the pictures.
Yes, very much so. And yeah, I'm happy to, I put some sort of short references in there, but I'm happy to send anything. If you want to like contact me directly, I can send anything on which is useful.
If there is no comment or questions, I think you have done a really great job,
Oh,
given
I
that there
think
was no,
Panyon has her, sorry, Shiva, has her
given that
hand
there
up.
was no documents. Yeah, let's see, Panyon. Please unmute yourself. Panyon, unmute yourself.
Feel free to type if you're. I was having technological difficulties at the beginning as well.
So, okay.
Sorry, Shiva, I did interrupt you.
Yeah, no, I was just telling you that you have done a great job because, as you say, there was no documents and nothing left of Matossian, and you have been digging really deep. I'm sure that how long is that you're doing this research on?
It's been a couple of years. Yes, but it's always good to have a lecture in your schedule to force you to do a bit more work on something.
So much.
But I hope, it's something that really it's something that I hope might feed into our cataloguing of the objects at the V&A. But I think he is a figure which in the arts of Iran he should, would be useful to have a more holistic view of what he was doing. So I'll try to write something up eventually.
We're waiting.
No pressure.
I think Panyan couldn't unmute herself. But if
Hi.
Oh, hi.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that. So thank you very much, Fuchsia. It was a wonderful talk. My question was about the publication. I was wondering if, first of all, I mean, what type of publication is that? Is it more kind of like promotional or kind of descriptive? And if you've managed to find other sort of issues somewhere else in different libraries, so we can sort of like track down where it was kind of distributed?
In terms of the catalogue?
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, I have to thank colleagues in Cairo for sending that to me, because so far I've only found one copy. Um, and so it's hard, you're right. I mean, it would be an interesting question to know what the dissemination of that was, and who it was aimed at. But at the moment, that's not something that I can answer. But actually, I didn't mention, but there's a second sale in 1952, because that's sort of post the acquisition of the Ades Collection in 1945. I haven't looked into that as deeply yet, but it's primarily of objects from Iran. So that's 1952. And I think actually he's having to sell off quite a lot at that date, I think. So that's sort of, again, it gives us a broader view of his of what he was collecting, and the amount of it, actually, because there was quite a lot. But no, these catalogs are they're really few and far between, which adds to the challenge.
Thank you.
All right, I think we don't have any more questions. Thank you so much again. That was really amazing. And I know that how much time you have done on this research, and it was really amazing for us who work with the same collections, the same dealers, and it's amazing for everyone who's working on these collections in the UK particularly. And we are all curious to know how these objects ended up in our collections. So thanks again, and it was really a pleasure having you. I would like to say that the video of all the talks, and this one included, will be on the YouTube of the Persian Manuscript Association. It will be like in a couple of days, then they can find it online, and enjoy the beautiful talk that you gave another time. Thank you so much, and have a good evening. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks. Thank you so much for the invitation. Bye.